This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are talking with Philip Hamburger about his most recent book, Liberal Suppression, Section 501c3 and the Taxation of Speech. Philip Hamburger is America's leading legal historian. He is the Maurice and Hilda Friedman Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. He is the author of Is Administrative Law Unlawful?, Law and Judicial Duty, and Separation of Church and State, all books that have been incredibly well received in legal scholarship. Philip Hamburger, glad to have you back on the program. When you were last with us, you were discussing your book, Is Administrative Law Unlawful?, which has gone on to receive many reviews, prizes, and I think made an incredible impact in shaping the way or starting a conversation about the problems of the administrative state, and even made its way into Supreme Court opinions. So glad to have you on the program.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here.
Thinking about this book, Liberal Suppression, we have met the enemy, and it is liberalism. Is that what you're arguing?
Oh, I'm not sure I'd go quite that far. As I try to make clear at the beginning of the book, liberalism has brought many blessings. It's been very valuable in counteracting narrow interests and prejudices. But on the other hand, it also comes with some costs. And the history of liberalism is not really known in this country, oddly enough. There actually is a history of liberal thought that begins in the 18th century. Liberality and liberal sentiments are very popular at the time of the founding and are even used to justify the federal constitution. But within liberalism, there were proclivities, tendencies, modes of thought that inevitably, if taken too far, would have costs. And one of these, which this book concentrates on, is what I call theological liberalism, a fear of the authority of ecclesiastical institutions, a fear of religious authority as a threat to individuals and their mental freedom. And this develops already in the 1730s, but it really begins to become popular in America in around 1800, and then it begins to have consequences, not least for freedom of speech.
So talk about this theological liberalism. Is it basically a low Protestant view? Is that a way to think about it? And thinking about the individual's relationship to God, to the state, to society, that individuals really need to be actively choosing on their own and determining things on their own with no sort of authoritative apparatus put on them.
Right. And an element of this obviously underlies much of our religious liberty, the theory that government should not be dictating to individuals what they should believe, rests ultimately on belief that an individual's own faith, and thus the individual's own belief, which cannot be coerced by government, is what determines their hopes for salvation. And so, yes, this is an aspect of Protestantism, although it's not incompatible also with some elements of Catholicism and other beliefs. The shift occurs, however, what makes it theological liberalism is not only a fear of government coercion, but a sense that the speech of churches is itself coercive. So that when a church insists on its doctrines, it's in a sense coercing persons. When a preacher tells you that you'll go to hell unless you believe a particular doctrine, that is coercing the individual and depriving the individual of freedom of speech. And this sort of fear of ecclesiastical authority and anxiety about the speech exercised by those in religious authority is taken so far, for example, by William Channing, 1830s, as to suggest that, in fact, this is worse than the Inquisition, that the harsh speech, the demanding speech, the importunities of a large sect or a majority actually deprive the individual of their freedom more than any state power could. And then you begin to get justifications for limits on speech.
Justifications for limits on speech. So theological liberalism doesn't remain theological liberalism, the way you write about it in the book, it becomes sort of it becomes sort of a shaping framework for the broader political mind in
Right.
many respects.
Theology, yes, right. So theology is never limited to religion. It's a vision of the world. One could view it as a psychological vision of the effects of speech, which is the way in which this theological liberalism still survives. The sense, for example, in contemporary debates about speech, that the harsh words of a colleague or someone telling you what your identity is, or speaking disagreeably about one's identity and who one is or one's beliefs, fears of other people's speech that I think underlie, for example, campus speech restrictions. All of this derives directly from theological liberalism. And of course, those who have these anxieties are not necessarily theological in any sense in their beliefs. But the structure of thinking derives from theological liberalism and has a long, long history in America. In that sense, contemporary speech restrictions actually have a deep history in this country. Only they've been taken further and further as the law increasingly reflects this anxiety about other people's words.
So, I mean, thinking, and I know this isn't the point of your book, I mean, in a way, theological liberalism seems at war with how human beings do actually form their opinions and live their lives and are shaped. I mean, we are inevitably, I mean, we do actually, even religion itself, it seems hard to think about it being just an individual exercise. Mm-hmm. We do this in churches, right. Synagogues. We, shape, we write things down. We, use them in, internal theological disagreement. And these, we are profoundly shaped by religious institutions.
Yeah.
And as I thinking about your book, it's almost as if the theological liberalism itself may just be incorrect with how human beings actually come to understand their place in the world.
Right. So the fears may be accurate, the hopes may be overstated, but it may be both the fears and the hopes, right? So of course, you're absolutely right. We are all shaped by the opinions of others around us. Do we go so far as to say that our freedom has been impinged upon? I suppose in some instances. Does that mean we should actually limit other people's speech to protect our internal freedom? I don't know about that. And that's where I think it just is taken a step too far. There's an interesting contrast here, by the way, between Tocqueville's thought and the thought of the theological liberals. And they quote, they're all aware of one another and they're quoting Tocqueville and so forth. They all understand that group opinion can shape individual opinion. But the interesting thing is that Tocqueville sees organized religion and other private organizations as an avenue to give expression to individual thought and give it a force in the world that it otherwise wouldn't have, thus allowing individuals to maintain some sort of political power and influence in an egalitarian world. In contrast, theological liberals say, these groups, these churches, in their exertions of their expressions of their belief, are actually suppressing the freedom of the individual to think for him or herself. So they see the same phenomenon, but just react very differently. And in a sense, sociologically, one could see that someone who still has attachments to localities and groups will find private groups a powerful mode of preserving a voice in a world in which one otherwise is an equal but anonymous dot. Whereas those of us who are, in a sense, liberated from our localities and communities or resent them, come to view the speech of these groups as profoundly threatening. And as a majority increasingly holds these theologically liberal views, we get contemporary liberalism and its anxieties about speech.
So we've got this theological liberal position, understanding, but not necessarily. So I guess what's the sort of triggering event that makes this a political problem, or that invites political changes into our country?
Right. So in the 18th century and early 19th century, many theological liberals were admirably open-minded about all sorts of others, but the reality is that their vision of dangerous ecclesiastical speech is, of course, modeled on anti-Catholicism. Much anti-Catholicism, indeed, increasingly is modeled on theological liberalism, and so the nativists, in reaction to Catholic immigration in the 1840s, adopt largely theologically liberal arguments against the Catholic Church. The Pope controls his bishops and controls Catholic individuals, shapes how they vote, and that not only threatens individual salvation, but also threatens democracy and the polity. And so fears of Catholics, especially Irish Catholics, prompts elevates theological liberalism into a political force, and turns it into a series of anxieties not only about the individual but also about the threat to the state, that ecclesiastical authority threatens democratic government.
So on this point, on sort of the nativist point and the liberal point, and then so the anti-Catholicism. Okay, I can see that being a powerful motivating element. But I guess the question too is bringing in the government in that response. What was sort of the fear here? Were Catholics voting as a bloc in a certain way? Was there anything that...
Absolutely. Sure. There's a half-truth on both sides
voting
here.
As a bloc here. Voting as a bloc in a way that would, threaten some key constitutional liberty. I guess, because I've always thought, my research into John Courtney Murray, he's sort of, a break in the way, or helps lead to some sort of break or development in how the Catholic Church thought about power and religion, and there being a government sponsored church and Catholic thought, and thinking about religious freedom. And the Catholic Church did sort of have these problems with liberalism and with sort of the kind of separation of church and state that was argued for in the 19th century. And so. But I guess the question in my mind has always been, but what evidence was there in America that this was actually operative in the voting of Catholics?
Oh, I think there's no doubt that Catholics often took political cues from the church, that Catholics often did vote as a bloc, particularly in urban areas. Nor is there any doubt that some Catholic clergy, not all, but some Catholic clergy espoused European-style views about church dominance and hoped through their voting blocks to essentially capture democracy. And so the excesses of Catholic propaganda undoubtedly seem very provocative to many Protestants. And all I can say there is it was very improbable that a minority was going to really capture the United States. Mm-hmm. And also, these are unrealistic fears in most instances that Protestants have. And perhaps even more to the point, just because a minority espouses views that one finds disreputable, and I think rightly reviewed as disreputable, doesn't mean one should deprive them of their First Amendment freedoms, whether of religion or speech. There are a lot of precautions one can take that run short of that.
Yes.
So, yes, there undoubtedly was a lot said on the Catholic side that might make folks worry. But then that came to be matched by Protestants suggesting that Catholics should be thought deprived of voting rights, deprived of speech, and so forth.
I'm thinking you talk some of this nativism and liberalism intertwining. You quote at times in the book from Hiram Evans, who was the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 20th century. And I guess that's, I know when you knew that, it was provocative, but it made sense. But so the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan understood liberal political theory very well and applied it against his foes. Talk about that.
Right. So Hiram Evans is the dominant leader of the Klan from 1922 until into the 30s. He's not a very nice man. This is somebody who, early in his Klan career, carves the letters KKK into the head of a black bellhop in Dallas. But he's not unsophisticated. And he leads the Klan to national prominence precisely because he understands how theological liberalism actually unites disparate groups into a mass movement. And in that sense, he touched a nerve that resonated across America. There was nothing really distinctive about this theological liberalism. It was shared across the United States, from the from Harvard philosophy department to Claverins in the Deep South.
So thinking about, I just want to read a quote, and this is at the beginning of the book. Hiram Evans in 1930, the book is The Rising Storm. Catholics understand exactly the political philosophy we offer them. This requires a codification of the rights and duties of churches under the principle of separation of church and state. Some of the questions involved are the legal position of all churches in respect to the state, to their members, and to each other, together with their duties toward the state, and the precise limits of their right to political activity, either directly or through religious power over their followers. In general, we must make Catholics know the American meaning of freedom, equality, and liberalism.
It's quite a quote, isn't it?
It is. It is, yeah. So I guess, this just sort of underscores what you're saying here. And I thought, but you're using that, so there's this remarkable confluence here of, I guess, the liberal mind and the way it's rising here. How does this intersect, though, with progressivism and sort of, I think, a rejection of how you're going to think about faction? Because I think that's what we're talking about here. If you perceive a faction operative, conventional constitutional doctrine or founding constitutional doctrine, but that's checked through federalism. That's checked through separation of church and state. And there's this sort of, that's a way the best way we have to deal with power and faction, and checking its ability to capture a piece or a part of the government. This book that you're writing, 501c3, we can talk more about that in a minute, but this sort of view of Hiram Evans that he expresses there, that's sort of this idea of we have to actually control speech and the minds of institutions themselves to effectuate a free regime.
Right. So it's curious. I think much scholarship recognizes that the vision of limited government that we see at the founding encounters some pushback from progressivism from the late 19th century up through the present. And so it's a tension between early American visions of limited power and progressive visions of righteous exercise of government power. But there's an intellectual element here that I think has been missing, and that is the role of liberalism, especially as it gets to be reconfigured by theological liberalism. Theological liberalism reshapes our liberalism to be aimed not only to involve fears of government, but fears of others in the society, including, of course, their speech as well as their economic influence. And this alters entirely the way we understand liberty and oppression. It comes to justify limits on other people's speech and religion and other expression, lest they threaten individuals. And of course, as an individualistic vision of oneself becomes prominent in the United States, one actually has a majority expressing liberal fears of mere minorities. So whereas the founding vision is all about preventing minorities clustering together to form an oppressive majority, that's Federalist number 10, for example, the product of theological liberalism and progressivism is actually to worry much more about others in society whose power might threaten one. Progressivism tends to emphasize these days the economic element of power. Theological liberalism, which bleeds over into and founds a sort of foundation for American progressivism, emphasizes the threat from in speech and expression. And the result is to justify a host of laws that are wildly incompatible with the First Amendment.
So I want to turn now to the 501c3 analysis in your book, or the way in which you've taken this provision, which we all sort of know about, and then kind of use that to highlight tremendous confluence of political problems in our country. But before I do that, and I could be really off base here, listening to you talk about this aspect of liberalism where it's not just the fear of government power, but it's the fear of religious institutions, certain idealistic institutions, expressing speech. I mean, it's almost as if I think about like a formal liberal vision of government, autonomous individuals, come to an agreement on a social contract for the protection of rights, so that they can live as free as possible and be protected. It's almost like that understanding outstrips government itself. It becomes a all-encompassing way for thinking how individuals should live. That sort of autonomy, contract, rights. It's abstract. It's a form, but and that sort of is how we negotiate life as a whole. It's almost like that's what you're expressing.
Well, so I think one can distinguish between the vision of individual choice and autonomy that underlies natural rights theory of government, and the contemporary liberalism that's shaped by theology, in which concerns of the individual, and then of course the majority state formed of individuals, becomes so extreme as to involve fears of speech and other people simply saying what they believe. And in that sense, one element of liberalism, the theological element of liberalism, has, in a sense, undermined the product of the more traditional 18th century and balanced 18th century liberalism. Okay. Can I say a few words about John Rawls?
I was going to ask you about that, but I know a huge part of your book is the 501c3 analysis, and so I was just going to think about, so in a way, what we're talking about here all sort of it cashes out politically in a lot of ways, but it's this provision that's so dominant, and talk about that and why you think it's so disruptive to American liberties.
Right. Yeah. So it's really rather an oddity, isn't it? We have a provision in the tax code, purports to be merely a technical matter, which limits the political speech of churches, educational organizations, and other charities. They're limited in persuading voters, and they're limited in persuading government about legislation. Now, one would have thought this is unconstitutional, and yet it's widely said to be perfectly acceptable. And that's the puzzle that gave rise to all of this. And it turns out to be important, not merely on its own merits, but it's really one of the earliest and most sweeping of the attempts at liberal suppression, the attempts to pursue one's anxieties about ecclesiastical speech by limiting it.
Okay.
And that's what happened, essentially. The courts look at this. It's very funny. In Reagan versus Taxation Without Representation, Supreme Court decision upholding 501c3, the court looks at it and said, if there were any evidence of suppression of ideas here, then we would take a different opinion. But, it's funny because the first person to propose the dual limits on speech that began to enter the tax code in 1934 and then again in 1954 was, the first person to propose this was Hiram Evans in 1930. 501c3 speech restrictions come out of a nativist vision of silencing ecclesiastical opponents, and the mouthpiece was none other than the imperial wizard of the KKK. And people just have never realized this. It's astonishing, actually.
Thinking about this, so much of the 501c3, I take it, rooted in anti-Catholicism. You also say rooted in anti-communism. This idea that, you can have, so we give you something, you won't be taxed at any rate, but you can't talk about politics, you can't engage in lobbying, you can't do other things. And the view is, because this is a subsidy or a tax expenditure by the government, we're actually doing you a favor. And so, and there's nothing unconstitutional about this. It's just a condition that we've placed on how you operate. And in any event, if you want to talk politics, just go form another organization. Right. I was going to ask, just thinking about that, you think about Catholicism, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops engages in all manner of political activity. I assume they're doing that under another corporate form. But they haven't really been inhibited politically. So I'm just thinking, what's this all about?
Right. So there's a wide range of reactions in churches and other organizations to 501c3. The sophisticated, large, and relatively well-endowed organizations lawyer up, and they understand the ins and outs. And there's a lot of room for some political speech. You want to say it in some of it in coded ways or through other organizations, but you can get a message out at least. If you're a smaller group, if you're poor, if you don't have a bevy of lawyers, you may learn very quickly just discretion is the better part of valor. And so part of what this book is about is actually the discrimination inherent in 501c3. The larger institutions can work their way through it at some cost, but not great cost. Smaller, poorer ones cannot. This already is problematic. I would add, however, that freedom of speech isn't a freedom to convey a message through one means or another. It's actually a freedom to speak. And when one realizes that, 501c3 doesn't look so good. It looks highly problematic.
There's also this question, I mean, and you point this out in the book, the tax expenditure claim is really a massive claim of government power. Because we don't tax you, somehow we've spent money on you.
Right. Well, in that case, we could all be silenced, right? So if I'm taxed at 50%, they can say, well, we didn't take the other 50%, that's a subsidy.
It was
Therefore, you shut up.
This was the precise argument, and I think this has settled down somewhat. There was talk of regulating foundations more so, and forcing them to do things the government wants them to do, and how they spend their money. And this was the precise argument, because we don't tax you.
Right.
Yeah.
The curious thing is, the really astonishing thing is the standard justification for 501c3s. This is a tax expenditure. Every tax lawyer you talk to, I used to be a tax lawyer, and every other tax lawyer I talk to will say, oh, well, it's a tax expenditure. But the hilarious thing is, actually, Stanley Surrey did not think it was a tax expenditure. Deductibility is a tax expenditure, but not exemption. And in fact, the
who is Stanley
Committee
Surrey?
of Congress, yes, who invented the tax expenditure theory.
Okay.
He didn't think it was a tax expenditure. And actually, Congress every year in one of its committees says very carefully, exemptions, 501c3, are not tax expenditures. But the vast majority of tax lawyers in the Supreme Court just blithely assume that it is. And this reflects just an astonishing indifference to the realities of either the theory or what's happening on the ground.
So your thought here is the reason why this has been upheld constitutional for so long. First of all, if any churches, this is my question, if any churches lost their tax status because they've expressed political opinions?
Occasionally, but the IRS understands that it's on such precarious constitutional grounds, it typically does not allow any dispute to rise up in the courts, which is in itself a curious constitutional problem.
I know the conservative public interest law firm Alliance Defending Freedom actually, I mean, they actually want it. I mean, they want this fight, and they I think they have a day. They sponsor churches. They get them to make political messages, and then I think they're very provocative. They deliver them to the IRS, and they're waiting.
But the IRS is not going to let this get to the court.
They're waiting for this.
The IRS is not going to let this court.
So that prompts the question: Why is this widely seen as constitutional? Then what sort of keeps it? It's not just inertia and apathy.
Right. I think theological and political prejudice, actually. And one can actually trace this. I can't go into great detail in this conversation, but I have a chapter on this. And the reality is, when a court knows the tax expenditure theory goes one way and they hold the other way, that's an interesting data point. When their doctrine on unconstitutional conditions points one way and they hold the other way, that's rather puzzling. And in fact, one can show that the theory of if you look at the theory that exemption, not talking about deductibility, but exemption for churches is a subsidy, actually has little place in the tax literature until after World War II. But it is a huge place in another sort of literature, a theological and liberal and nativist literature, which is antagonistic, indeed deeply spiteful against ecclesiastical institutions. And what happens after the war is that argument makes a leap from the theological literature into the legal literature.
And also,
And
and also your discussion, in another sense, your discussion of John Rawls in the book, who has, to my mind, really shaped the court's thinking about religion and the way
yes.
it can or cannot influence, public policy, and also, I guess, in the popular mind, and I think even amongst religious people themselves, they've sort of accepted a popularized form of Rawlsian thinking here about what they should and should not do. Talk about that. Talk about the influence of Rawls and all of this. Yeah.
So Rawls was not writing to defend 501c3, but he was surely aware of it. He's writing to give expression to a long tradition of liberal democratic political theory. One can find it in Dewey and in a host of lesser ecclesiastical writers. Most folks looking at Rawls thinks it's a secular theory of secular government. But in fact, it comes out of a theological tradition that flourished in America in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s and 50s. And Rawls's arguments echo those earlier arguments one after another. And his conclusion that churches and allied institutions should withhold, idealistic organizations should withhold their speech in certain political contexts, the central political contexts of persuading in connection with legislation, etc., actually comes out of this nativist liberal tradition. And so, in fact, if you think about it, there's a rather curious parallel between Hiram Evans, Imperial Wizard of the KKK, and John Rawls, who is genuinely a very distinguished philosopher and by no means shares the prejudices of Evans. So why do I connect them? Yeah. It's not to be invidious about John Rawls, but I think one learns a lot about American intellectual history when one realizes that they both are self-consciously liberal. They both want a liberal philosophy of democratic society. They both think that essential to this is having some folks in the society quiet themselves down.
Yes.
And they both identify the same folks who should quiet themselves down, namely ecclesiastical institutions, universities, other idealistic organizations. Those are the ones John Rawls actually specifically identifies as organizations whose reasoning is non-public reasoning.
Yeah, talk about that, and the public reason. When I've thought about that, public reason is how the public wants to reason, but Rawls means something else.
He means something very different, doesn't he? Right.
And it also, I mean, as I've, and I have conversations with people deeply influenced by Rawls on this, and my conclusion is, what this really leads to is I'm not supposed to think that deeply about politics or express myself deeply. In a way, it's sort of you're inviting citizens to be alienated from themselves, or you will in fact alienate a number of citizens from the government that they really can't shape.
Rawls was a thoughtful man, and he actually discusses this, right? At one point he says, there's a danger here of a certain shallowness.
Yeah.
There's a danger that people will not be able to discuss in central public debates the things that matter most deeply to them. Now, to his mind, this is valuable because it creates a sort of consensus, not really a consensus, but what he calls an overlapping consensus, and that's essential for government.
Yeah.
But that's a tad awkward because it may be that we have the wrong views in that consensus, and if one can't challenge it by stepping outside it, then we as a society are in deep trouble. If you think of public policy and everything we do is experimental, you don't really know the truth until you pursue it a little bit and think about it and discuss it. A lot goes undiscussed. And as you say, the danger is also at the personal level that people become alienated and disconnected from public life. And that indeed is what has happened, isn't it?
It also is I mean, these are all well-known objections to Rawls. Deeply incongruent with sort of the major popular constitutional movements in our country. We can just think about how they've been incredibly motivated by people, motivated religiously, and also expressing themselves in religious terms, and it's almost as if that bothers Rawls, and bothering Rawls, but yet not thinking, one way to think about the consensus is it's actually something predicated on what citizens think is true.
Right.
They
There's
think
something deeply
yeah,
conformist about this, isn't there?
yeah,
And this is problematic both at the personal level and at the and politically. Rawls writes in the wake of this, the civil rights movement.
yeah.
What was he thinking, saying that one shouldn't challenge, that one shouldn't step outside the overlapping consensus? And the answer is he's writing in a tradition which is theological, in which the majority of individuated individuals needs to be protected from the overbearing speech of more cohesive minorities. And in that sense, although he's not anti-Catholic by any means, he's writing in a mode that echoes ideas that were developed in a less sanitary environment.
It's interesting. So one way is I thought Rawls's ideas have avoided your critique. I think precisely because in the academy they're perceived as incredibly useful and true in dealing with religion, and in the religious right and all of that. And it's become very effective that way. Also, it is interesting.
It helps to shut
your people down.
It helps to shut one's eyes. I think one can view Rawls's ideas as a neutral philosophy rising above the contending masses. It's not only possible if one actually ignores where his ideas come from, the tradition in which he's writing, and the details of American history. So I think one of the goals of the book, actually, it's not just about 501c3. One of the goals of the book is to understand political theory in context. And I know philosophers will say, no, ideas should not be discussed down in the muck. And I'm not trying to splash muck on fine ideas. But I think if one actually wants to understand those ideas in our society, both their consequences and where they came from, one has to actually understand that there are some affinities there that are, as I said, deeply unsanitary.
On this question, thinking about the government using, the tools of 501c3 to shape the arguments that religious organizations and other idealistic, we'll say, organizations, how they can express themselves. How has so this is largely the administrative state. How has the administrative state have they been able to use this in measurable ways to homogenize speech? Has it been successful, or did, a standard public choice story is, these institutions sort of figure out a way to game regulations, usually for their own benefit, and they're usually not necessarily that impeded by it. But there's a larger problem here, and an economic story would be how the government can actually shape the way people do business, and how entrepreneurs that will not arise because of regulations. So I guess here the question is, have they actually been able to sort of stifle a lot of speech? And you say,
we live in a society, obviously, in which there's a great freedom of speech. The qualification is that the government has been very good at limiting some of the harder edges of speech. They don't want to be part of public debate. And although churches still have a prominent role in shaping policy, it's much diminished from what it would be. And the sort of churches that can prevail in public are not the full range of churches. And so there's a dramatic discrimination, actually, among churches, both theologically against theologically orthodox and against the poor. And none of this is a coincidence, right? And so, yes, there's a lot of speech, but it is 501c3 is part of a deliberate element, the speech restrictions in it, that is, to limit certain types of speech and where it will be heard. And one can see that a lot is followed from this. So if you think about it, by the 1950s, people who wanted to express those non-shallow views, their most deeply held feelings, religious feelings in the public sphere in connection with policy, could no longer do so through their churches. Part of this was because many churches were becoming theologically liberal and didn't want their congregants to engage that way. And part of it is because other churches were told, you, the theologically orthodox who want to work through your churches, you're not going to be able to do that so easily. And it's not entirely coincidence. I don't want to say find direct causation here, but it may not be entirely coincidence that in the 60s, a large amount of discontent, personal dissatisfaction, personal and political, could not find its way through the moderating effect of institutions, but spilled out onto the streets. If you think, just take an example. In the Black community, churches and church leaders have played an enormously important political and social role because Blacks were suppressed in politics for such a long time.
Yes.
And are you going to then say, well, churches should not participate? There are real costs on the ground to try to stifle politics through churches, and the results may be more religious than actually ecclesiastical participation in politics. It's hard to measure these things, but one has to worry about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. So with the civil rights movement, 1950s, 1960s, heavily led though by the Black church. And
That's right.
And then your analysis, if I heard you correctly, is all of the unrest we saw in the latter half of the 1960s. Where
I don't want to blame it on 50. I do not want to blame it on 501c3. But it's okay. They're all part of it's all part of one tendency in which we cannot work through our private institutions successfully on the things that matter to us most.
Okay.
And this is actually why part of this, just another facet of this problem, is increasingly the organizations that have full unhampered political speech are specialized political organizations. And so there's sort of a semi-monopoly in full political speech among political organizations. Business organizations don't have full political speech. Our idealistic institutions have even less political speech. So where are you going to go for your full political and meaningful political speech?
Yes.
And unfortunately, that's the political parties.
The parties
and other political
or these
or C4s and so like. Yeah, that's right.
That's interesting. It's interesting too to think about. So, how would our politics be different if we had these much broader organizations? You might bring in more people. People would moderate each other better. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Right. And imagine, so the IRS. The reality is, when it has religion, one can bring ecclesiastical speech into politics only through IRS compliant committees. That's not exactly spiritual or uplifting mode of engagement.
No, interesting. So thinking about which is really contemporary here. So we just had the Tea Party episode with the IRS delaying or denying 501c3 status to certain groups, and as we've learned, they were looking for code words to try and figure out who these groups were. And then there's just these connections with certain senators. Did the IRS actually think they were doing the bidding of the Democratic political party?
Right.
And then there was a settlement to these groups. That feeds into your analysis, but also, but thinking about
part of what the book's about is the growing administrative control of speech, and in particularly administrative licensing of speakers and speech. And the result is what I call wholesale control. You think about it, the Alien and Sedition Acts all involved retail control. The government actually had to identify some speech they thought was bad, an individual who said it, and they had to prosecute that person in court with a judge, with a jury, in full due process of law. That's a slow, painstaking mode of controlling speech. But the modern approach, which actually just echoes the 17th century Star Chambers approach, is simply to subject it all to administrative licensing, in which case an administrator, in this case the IRS, if you want permission to enjoy untaxed political speech, they can just sit on it and not respond for several years. Mm-hmm. And they don't have to tell you why.
Or if you say something...
So it's much more efficient.
Yeah, or then now there's this threat. If you contribute or are part of organizations that are controversial, your name gets released to the public.
Right. Yeah. That's views on that used to be thought a singularly dangerous thing. Now I gather in some quarters it's applauded.
Yes. Well, apparently that's what we learned. So thinking about now. So you end a chapter, contemporary liberal anxieties and fears. How does this go on in your mind? How are we sort of dealing with this right now?
Well, I'm sorry to say the anxieties about other people's speech, which I think drives this liberal suppression, has only gotten worse. And it's not altogether a surprise. We are more individuated than we used to be, and that inevitably leads to greater anxieties about other people's speech. People saying things that might make you feel constrained within, and in that sense, the anxieties that lead to 501c3 now lead to campus speech restrictions and the like. And I think one of the goals of this book is to try to identify the underlying concerns that lead to contemporary speech restrictions so that we can more adequately understand them and deal with them.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I mean, I don't want to end on a negative note. But as I thought about your book, and you've done this in the interview, you bring in Tocqueville to sort of underscore the significance of associational life. Tocqueville's fear about individualism, or the way he defines individualism, is the way in which democracy could lead to this sort of reinforcing loop of retreat of individuals into themselves, just immediate family, maybe a few friends, but not venturing out. And I take it, your book, one outcome of this is how do we break that loop, because we seem to be in that thing right now, and and how do you bring individuals out of themselves to work with other people, and then the fear, as Tocqueville expresses, the dominance of public opinion. As you lose these associational contexts, you just sort of adopt public opinion for various reasons of convenience, and you're not actually, so people are actually not doing the liberal thing properly understood.
Well, I although I tend to be a pessimist about many things, I'm not so far a pessimist as to give up hope here. To coin a phrase, human beings are social animals, and that will inevitably bring them out of themselves. And I think once one understands a problem, it's clarifying. It concentrates the mind. It allows one to overcome it, and that can be true personally. It can be true politically, and of course, it can be true legally. These are problems that can be dealt with through law, and I think, as we see on campuses, there's an increasing understanding that what was well-intentioned in the way of restrictions may actually be very dangerous. I think that's also true in the larger social sphere. We'll see that some of the things we thought valuable, be it Rawls's philosophy or the restrictions 501c3, may in fact be very dangerous. And once one understands them for what they are, then one can take action against them.
Philip Hamburger, thank you so much. We've been talking with the author of Liberal Suppression. I hope it does well and drives debate the way it did your previous book on the administrative state.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.